Hi everyone, I'm Daniela Kwiatkowski.
And I'm Jack Naglieri.
I'd like to thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Multidimensional Assessment of Executive Function Across the Lifespan, From Theory to Practice. And now I'm excited to introduce to you our guest speaker today. Jack A. Naglieri, PhD, is a research professor at the Curry School of Education at the University of Virginia, senior research scientist at the Devereux Center for Resilient Children, and emeritus professor of psychology at George Mason University. He is a fellow of APA Division 15 and 16 and recipient of several awards for his contribution to the field of psychology. Dr. Naglieri is the author or co-author of more than 300 scholarly papers, books, and tests, including the newly released CEFI Adult. His scholarly research includes investigations related to topics such as intelligence theory and assessment, cognitive interventions, executive function, intellectual disabilities, specific learning disabilities, giftedness, protective factors related to resilience, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I'll pass it over to you, Dr. Naglieri.
Thank you. As we go through today, I will be referring to and showing data from several of the tests and rating scales that I have published over the years. This page provides that information. And as I mentioned, you can go to my webpage, jacknaglieri.com, and on that webpage I have information about the various topics that I've written on, copies of my research papers, book chapters, my PowerPoint presentations that I've given on a variety of topics, including autism or executive function, as we're doing today. And you can also email me directly through that website. But let's start to talk about the session today. What exactly is the session about? Today, I'm really excited to speak about this concept of executive function. And in a lot of ways, I think it is among the most important abilities that we have. And in a nutshell, when we talk about executive function today, we'll be talking about it as it relates to the decisions that we make when we choose to achieve a goal. And what makes me so excited about this concept is that we can successfully encourage people to better utilize executive function, and it has a considerable impact on success in academic environments and others. Ultimately, if we improve EF, we really improve a person's functioning in many aspects of life, which is why I like to talk about this workshop. So I like to talk about this topic of EF from multiple perspectives. And I'm going to begin by giving everyone the very big picture here. The view that I'll be using as we go through this webinar today is that the frontal lobes and the neurocognitive ability that the frontal lobes provide is the foundation of executive function. And the expression of the frontal lobes can be seen in behaviors that might be related to cognition, like working memory, for example, behaviors related to social emotional skills, and academic and job skills. And so this will be the foundation, this will be the superstructure for what we'll do in this hour-and-a-half session. We're going to begin by just getting a big picture about executive function. Then we'll look at behaviors related to executive function and how it can be assessed. Cognition or intelligence related to executive function and how it can be assessed. Social emotional skills, also a reflection of executive function. And then academic and job performance also have a foundation in the frontal lobes and executive function. And then towards the end, we'll look at research. We'll actually look at research right away, but towards the end, we'll look at research across these different areas that nicely ties together these different expressions of executive function. And then when we get to the end, we'll talk about, well, how would you manage information from different tools about these different aspects of executive function? How would you manage them in a comprehensive evaluation? So let's get started and begin with just a reminder. I'm sure that everyone is aware of the famous case of Phineas Gage, the person who really got us interested in the front part of the brain. And I'll remind you that for many years, many professionals thought the frontal lobes really were not very important. But of course, Phineas helped us see things very differently. When that rod passed through his head and damaged his frontal lobe, he was changed very dramatically. And the importance, of course, of the frontal lobes is what we're going to be focusing on today, especially dorsolateral frontal cortex. So this is where a person creates plans and strategies, makes decisions about how to do things, checks to see if those solutions work or not, come up with new solutions as needed. And executive function and the frontal lobes are very, very important whenever we're in an environment that's novel. So just to remind everybody, before the accident, Phineas Gage was described as having a well-balanced mind and seen as a shrewd, smart businessman who could get the job done. But afterwards, after his accident and his frontal lobes didn't function well, he couldn't think very well, couldn't strategize. He was behaviorally out of control. He couldn't perform his work, and he couldn't get along with other people. But in order to really have this discussion, we need to start by answering the very important question, what exactly do we mean by executive function? And of course, if we read the literature, we know that A.R. Luria was one of the first people to actually talk about this concept of executive function. And his student, Nick Goldberg, has provided us with a wonderful collection of books, especially on the frontal lobes. And Nick likes to talk about EF as an orchestra leader. But he has some other ideas that I think are particularly important. Not just that the frontal lobes provide us with complex decision-making and stuff, but rather that the frontal lobes make us human and make us so unique as a species on this planet and make every single one of us on this webinar and every single person in the world unique as people. It's that function, it's that relationship between the frontal lobes and the environment in which somebody is reared and grows up. So when we talk about executive function, we really are talking about things like leadership, strategizing, paying attention, noticing things, changing things when necessary. And as you'll see when we get towards the end of this session here, sex differences and the importance of social emotional skills. And of course, just general cognitive development and learning. Now, when we talk about executive function or functions, we have to ask this question, should there be an S at the end of the word function or not? And when we look at different definitions, we see there's so much inconsistency, and there's a lot of abilities or executive functions that people write about, like initiation or working memory, strategy use, self-regulation, and so on. In the chapter that I wrote with some of my colleagues in our Handbook of Executive Function, we found so many definitions. But when you start to step back and look at them as a group, we really have three kind of groups. Some people say that its executive function is the best description, meaning it's a unidimensional concept. Other people say that executive function has many, many parts, so it's a multidimensional concept. And then some people say it's a unitary concept, but it has a lot of different parts. In order to get a better understanding of what we should conceptualize this as, in other words, as having many parts or just one, when I wrestled with this question, I decided that the best way to answer it would simply be to use one of our scales that we had developed at the time, the Comprehensive Executive Function Inventory, or CEFI for short, and the adult version of that CEFI called CEFI Adult. The beauty of being a test author, as I am, is we have standardization and validity samples that are large, and standardization samples that by definition match the US population, so we can generalize to that population and we can answer these really critical questions. Now, just to give you a kind of a window of where we're going next, this is not an esoteric question. If we decide that the answer to the question is multidimensional, then we'll make decisions about if a person has or does not have an executive function disorder based upon any of those parts. If we say the answer is executive function singular, then it's the collection of those, or a total score, so to speak, that we would use to make the decision if they have an executive function difficulty or not. So this is a very important question, and we're going to answer it, I think, very definitively with the set of data from the CEFI and the data from the CEFI Adult. Now, just to tell you a little bit about how we went about conducting this research, we created the CEFI and the CEFI Adult using many of the kinds of things that people talk about when they talk about executive function. And as this list here, this 9 areas shows, attention, inhibitory control, planning, emotional regulation, initiating and self-monitoring, flexibility organization, and working memory. So we have we have written items according to these particular areas. And of course we have all the items as a whole. So what we did was we used our standardization sample. So for the CEFI, that was 1,400 parent raters, 1,400 teacher raters, and 700 self-ratings. And the sample represents the US population, so we have the generalizability, very important. We divided that sample into 2. The first set of 3 experiments, really, for parents, teachers, and self, so we had those 3 groups. The first half, we did factor analysis at the item level. And then for the other half of the sample, we did factor analysis at the 9 scale level. You could think of those as 9 subtests. So we wanted to be sure that the way we were organizing the data didn't influence our results. And what we found is very nicely illustrated here in these 2 slides. So this is 6 experiments. And across the 6 experiments, we get the same answer. It's very clear that executive function best described this collection of items. Now, this is for children, 5 to 18. Let's see what we get. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot that we also did is we wanted to be sure that gender or race or ethnic group, age or clinical or educational status wasn't somehow a confound. And when we looked at the coefficients of congruence across these groups, we find extremely high coefficients. So this means we're getting the same results no matter how we cut the data. Now, with the CEFI Adult, we followed the same procedure. We looked at the item level and we looked at this 9 scale level for adults who were rated themselves and adults rated by an observer. So we have another 3,200 people, and we got the same result. And again, we looked at the adult consistency by gender, by race, ethnic, by age and clinical status got the same kind of findings. So when we look at these data for individuals aged 5 to 80, with a sample size of nearly 7,000 representing the US population, we see that the concept of executive function is really best represented as a unidimensional concept. Like Nick Goldberg suggested, when we talk about executive function, we're really talking about, as he describes, the orchestra leader. Well, there's a lot of instruments in an orchestra, but the orchestra as a whole is not defined by any one of those instruments. It's defined by the collection of the whole. So when I talk about executive function, I talk about this definition of how you do what you decide to do. That means you start with a goal and you have an intention. And you might need to gather more information in order to make a better decision about what solution to try. And you would select that plan and you'd apply it, and you might see if it works or not, change it if you need to. Eventually, you get to where you need to be. And that's really the essence of executive function. It's really about how you do what you decide to do. And that's a very important point when I talk about intervention. I'll be emphasizing that executive function is when the person decides how to do something, not when the person is following a script that someone else wrote for him or her. Now, I want to speak about another really important foundational concept here. And this is also something that Nick Goldberg discusses in his book, and I discuss with my colleague Tulio Otero in our most recent book on the essentials of CAS2 assessment. And if you look at these two curves here, along the horizontal, we move from, over time, a novel task to a well-learned task. And if you notice that the role of executive function is maximized whenever the task is novel. Once the task becomes really well learned, it becomes a skill. You do it without really thinking about it. And because you're doing it without thinking about it, then that by definition means EF doesn't play a role. EF is going to be involved when you are thinking about it. And you might be doing something that you've done many, many times before, but the situation somehow has changed, and now all of a sudden the role of EF is maximized. So this interplay of how much do we use EF and how much do we just do what we do is something that's very important in all settings, from academic to work to life. Now, when we do use EF, of course, that demands initiation and organizing and attending and remembering where we are and flexibility and so on. So all these kinds of aspects of EF that we talk about are certainly part of what we should look at in a good assessment. But any one of these in and of themselves is not going to be sufficient.